Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction and the invitation to speak. I know there are family, friends, colleagues in the audience and online, so thank you for joining us and staying with us this long. I'm feeling very inspired by the state of the field. I think there's a lot to be excited about. It must have been fate because while en route from New England to London across the North Atlantic for this conference, I rediscovered Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean. It's a really good movie. If you haven't seen it, I forgot how good it was. And I forgot about this memorable scene in which the interceptor is firing on the Black Pearl, not with powder and shot, but silverware. Google this, and there's a whole Reddit thread on the historical accuracy of this scene. Jokes aside, today I'll be speaking on silver in French colonial Saint-Domingue, the western half of Hispaniola, now Haiti. The eastern side is, or was, the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo. Sometimes you see that used for the French colony, but that's now the Dominican Republic, a different place, same island, however. That said, we'll travel today across the French Caribbean with stops in the Lesser Antilles and in Louisiana. So many of you will have recognized the detail from my title slide, taken from a portrait of what looks like any old French aristocrat, now at the National Gallery here in London. The subject, however, Vaudreuil, was actually born in Saint-Domingue. His father was Canadian, his uncle was the last governor of New France, his mother was a Creole, a white Creole from Saint-Domingue, the daughter of another colonial official. Before becoming a full-time courtier, however, Vaudreuil had pursued a military career, and the armor in the corner of this portrait certainly evokes that cornerstone of noble French identity. Vaudreuil, however, was immensely wealthy thanks to an inheritance that included sugar plantations in what is now Haiti. He's 18 years old in this portrait, and he's actually pointing to the colony and his place of birth, place of those estates. There's a reason that France saw fit to divest itself of Canada in order to keep its Caribbean holdings at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. Saint-Domingue alone was a leading producer of sugar by the mid-18th century, of course grown using enslaved African labor, with roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee imported by Europe coming from this colony, fueling fortunes on both sides of the Atlantic. Sugar was also the impetus for an extraordinary silver object collected by none other than Robert Barker. Found by Barker here in London and marked LD, this sugar caster is attributed to one Louis or Louis Dupont. Dupont was the son, we believe, of a Huguenot silversmith from Poitiers, who began his own career in London by about 1736. He was in Saint-Domingue, however, by 1753, the year that his son Stephen apprenticed here in London with Samuel Courtauld. The colony's already famous wealth, combined with Dupont's or Dupont's bankruptcy, may have been enticement enough for him to travel across the Caribbean in search of greener pastures. I've not yet come across where exactly he was working in the colony, but all likelihood he was working in the colonial capital of Cap Français, the Paris of the Antilles. With respect to the sugar caster itself, although to me it feels a bit more Anglo in feel, that baluster form with the pierced lid transcends the Anglo-French cultural divide. The somewhat simple, chaste decoration is certainly in keeping with that modern Rococo aesthetic that prevailed on both sides of the English Channel and both sides of the Atlantic. More importantly, and my thanks to Wynyard for pointing this out to me, but the silversmith traced out that pattern of scrolls and rocailles using a series of applied dots or spots that, though faint, point to a colonial rather than a metropolitan manufacture. So Luke, that's the spidey sense, let's say, for a colonial facture as opposed to a retailed metropolitan-made object. Dupont's sugar caster provides a compelling entry point for us to consider more critically colonial Caribbean silver, both more generally and against a backdrop of identity and mobility across the wider Atlantic world. Robert Barker's research indicates that Dupont actually went to Jamaica first, and so we can liken him in this respect to one Abraham Lefrancis or Lefrançois, another silversmith of probable Huguenot extraction who moved from London to Kingston Jamaica in 1749. And I'm showing here an example of that second silversmith's work, a coffee pot that survives with a history of ownership in New York, with marks for Jamaica assay master Anthony Danvers. These elegant objects conveniently encapsulate, and even allied, the economic history of the Caribbean, with the sugar caster's intended contents forming the principal source of Saint-Domingue's wealth before the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Although we readily associate Haiti with sugar, sometimes called white gold, precious metals quite literally illuminate the island nation's colonial history. As early as 1594, the Spanish had found gold on Hispaniola, some of which included what the indigenous Taino people referred to as guanine, an example at right. This is actually an alloy of copper, gold, and silver in circulation throughout Central America and the Caribbean basin. Having enslaved the Taino, the Spanish exploited what little gold there actually was on Hispaniola before the arrival of the French, who were also seeking riches in the New World. Beginning in the 1620s, French pirates began using the western half of Hispaniola as a very convenient base from which to essentially pursue Spanish vessels laden with treasure. As evidenced by these images, tales of the boucaniers, the flibustiers, these French pirates, captivated audiences into the next century and beyond. The frontispiece you see here from 1743 suggests how these pirates were indiscriminate in their search for silver and gold, sparing neither Carib nor Spaniard. After several lawless decades, French military occupation of Hispaniola began in the 1680s, with Saint-Domingue officially passing under jurisdiction of the French crown in 1697. France immediately set about establishing a plantation economy, one that privileged sugar, but also encompassed coffee, cacao, indigo, even some cotton. So fast forward to 1789, and the population of Saint-Domingue stood at about 556,000 people altogether. 32,000 whites, 24,000 free people of color, and 500,000 people of enslaved people of African birth or descent. It's an astounding figure that also accounts for half of the enslaved population in the entire Caribbean. Slavery was to remain at the heart of economic and government policy in Saint-Domingue and other Caribbean colonies for the rest of the 18th century. Like piracy, the institution also proved a recurring challenge to officials' authority. It also came to shape standards and regulations for precious metals. In October of 1710, so quite early, officials passed a decree forbidding Saint-Domingue silversmiths from buying or otherwise acquiring silver in any form from the enslaved. The ordinance was twofold. Authorities were responding to incidents in which slaves owned by silversmiths were accused of stealing silver from their masters. This gave rise to suspicions over purity. So it's an early documented example of resistance by the enslaved in a Caribbean context that also establishes the presence of working silversmiths in the colony of Saint-Domingue within a decade of French rule. The law required silversmiths and goldsmiths to personally mark their work and also formally register that mark, referred to in French as a poinçon. The 1710 edict also anticipated a much more elaborate set of regulations promulgated in January of 1781, partly in response to wartime shortages of cash during the American War of Independence. Provisions contained within that new 1781 legislation included the creation of an actual assay office in every colonial town. The assay master was to inspect gold and silver before applying a new countermark dubbed the poinçon de la colonie. This mark is quite possibly the anchor and letter C seen on some extant coins found by Robert Barker. The C is ostensibly for Cap Français, referred simply to as Le Cap in the 18th century, the only port in the colony in which an assay office was actually created before 1789. As evidenced by the clipped gold coin at left, however, other French Caribbean colonies were facing similar issues with respect to a standard for gold as well as silver. And so you see at left a Portuguese or rather Brazilian gold coin, a so-called gold Joe. named for João V of Portugal, whose profile appears on one side of a plugged coin. The plug is marked with an AR for A. Ruffi, a goldsmith and sword maker from Saint-Pierre in Martinique. Ruffi was charged with keeping a gold weight standard promulgated in 1798 during Martinique's British occupation. Similar care was also taken for regulating silver on that island, and so at right, by the same silversmith, goldsmith, a monogrammed spoon at right that bears the maker's crowned AR monogram punches flanking a crown ostensibly for the colony of Martinique. And my thanks to Wynyard for bringing this spoon to my attention. In Saint-Domingue, the 1781 ordinance addressed a very real situation whereby local goldsmiths were both making and repairing and retailing precious metal articles. Published from 1766 to 91, Haiti's first newspaper, the Affiche Américaine, is replete with announcements of local and imported goods for sale, as well as rewards for those lost by their owners. The number of misplaced watches, rings, gold-tipped canes outside the colony's theaters is really something. And you see the playhouse, or the comédie, at upper right in this watercolor view of Cap Français. Most of the colony's silversmiths ran their businesses in urban centers like Le Cap. They were also using enslaved labor, as we've seen was true in other colonies, other island colonies. So at lower left, we see in the newspaper the African-born Fortuné, not the name I would have chosen for him, but described as an orfèvre, or a goldsmith, who ran away in 1766. Fortuné's ethnicity is recorded as Congo, and it's tempting to consider whether he was already trained as a metalsmith in Africa. In comparison, at right, we see Augustin, described as Dutch at the time of his escape in 1774. Now, had he actually come from the Low Countries or been trained there before coming to be enslaved by a white silversmith in Cap Français? We don't know. More likely, perhaps, is the possibility that he had arrived by way of a Dutch Caribbean colony like Curaçao, even Suriname. Worth mentioning here is how, in accordance with the 1710 edict, although white Creole and immigrant silversmiths, jewelers, and others could legally continue to rely upon enslaved labor, free craftspeople of color were banned from the trade. However, the law was routinely flouted. Perhaps the most famous example of this is future Haitian revolutionary Vincent Auger. Born in Saint-Domingue in the 1750s, Auger was the son of a Frenchman and a free woman of color. He was sent to Bordeaux in 1768, where he apprenticed as a silversmith. I have yet to find with whom he apprenticed or a piece with his mark, so if you see one, please let me know. But I offer here as an example a covered sugar bowl with the mark of Bordeaux silversmith David. Auger could have easily seen and been tasked with the making, the repair of such objects during the course of his apprenticeship. Interestingly, he does not appear to have worked as a silversmith in the colony when he returned in 1774 or 75. He, however, did become Cap Français' wealthiest free merchant of color. However, in the surviving papers for his various business activities, he is often not identified by race, which is interesting. But by the late 1780s, he travels to France in 1788, this time to Paris, to lobby on behalf of his mixed-race peers, going so far as to demand political representation in the National Assembly and even the right to vote. And it's actually granted. But when he returns to the colony to essentially bring the news, colonial authorities say no. Auger plots a kind of a coup. He's arrested and he's actually sentenced. He's executed. He's broken on the wheel in 1791. Now, switching gears, the rest of this talk will lean a little more thematic, if not equally dramatic, so thank you for your indulgence as we explore together. I should note that fire, humidity, hurricanes, insects, revolution, all have conspired to make the study of Haitian material culture generally difficult. I'm not aware, for example, of any surviving goldsmiths' account books like we have in places like Boston and Philadelphia or London, for that matter. That said, one element of French civil law that carried over to the colonies was very precise notarial record keeping. French colonial probate inventories are a gold mine. They're one of my favorite things to read. I'm not going to really actually get into those today because I have another will and testament that I'd like to kind of use as a case study. But an example that has the same attention to detail. So what you're looking at on the screen at right is the final will and testament of one Marie-Anne Couturier, made in 1814. So Madame was born in Saint-Domingue's more remote southern peninsula in 1747. She was a white Creole, or colonial-born woman, who fled the colony during the Haitian Revolution. She traveled to England, then the United States, arriving in New York from London before heading south to Baltimore, where she died shortly after making this will. So this is a full decade after Haiti's emergence as a sovereign state, the first in the Caribbean, and the world's first free black republic. I should add that Couturier originally composed her will in French, so this is a translation made 10 years later when some creditors came knocking. I think they were actually cousins, but anyways, someone wanted the money. As indicated, she was a divorcee, so somewhat revolutionary in her own right. But more importantly, for our purposes, she had amassed a huge fortune in Saint-Domingue before the outbreak of revolution. The source of which lay in coffee grown on 5 plantations. By her count, so she must have had good memory, 369,000 coffee trees grew on her lands. Her principal plantation, Bellevue, contained some 200,000 trees and was home to 160 enslaved people, the majority of whom were African-born. But there are some interesting notes on their occupation, their trade. Frank and Anthony are described as English, as masons and turners. Perhaps they were from Jamaica. There's a woman named Madeleine who's described as Mississippi, perhaps a native woman from the Mississippi Valley brought during the 1729 Natchez Revolt in Louisiana. People who were deported from Louisiana to the colonies. In the will, Couturier paints an evocative, at times shocking portrait of her former life. She deemed the air of her estates, quote, tempered, always cool, with excellent soil. This, she declared, is the portrait of the residence I regret. The wistful, longing tone is remarkable, as is the cognitive dissonance. As much as she extols the view, which on clear days allowed her to see as far as Cuba, there is no mention of enslaved living conditions, which would have resembled what you see at the top of my slide, a view of a Saint-Domingue plantation created in 1757 by a visiting French officer, still quite sanitized from a larger panoramic view in ink and watercolors. As Couturier wrote, she had fled the colony with the evacuation of the French, so possibly as late as 1803, if not early 1804. That's with the defeat of Napoleonic troops sent to reinstate French rule. However, the will is full of these allusions to a reestablishment of order. Not only was this white Creole woman convinced that the Haitian Revolution was nothing but a temporary setback, but she fully expected to recover her property, both real and movable, enslaved bondspeople, carriages. She describes 2 carriages with 2 seats with gold moldings with velvet, one with green bottom with velvet, etc. Very similar to the green carriage you see at lower left, seen in an inset illustration from a map of another island sugar plantation. The 2-horse carriage is manned by a postilion and 2 footmen. The seated woman, the passenger, faces forward, ignoring the sight of 2 enslaved figures depicted nude and in chains, one wearing a punishment collar. Couturier could be the woman in the carriage, and she indicated that hers had been stolen by 2 free men of color during the revolt. Quote, "My Negroes will tell you who committed these thefts," she declared confidently. Now, political turmoil typically leaves little time to make an exit or prepare an escape. More than a few Saint-Domingue refugees fled with little more than the clothes on their back. Some set sail for France or nearby islands. Many in that first wave of exiles set sail for France. Sought asylum in American ports like New York, Charleston, and especially Philadelphia. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with silver? In the description of her stolen carriages, Madame Couturier declared, quote, "We have a right to take our property where we find it. I give you all these details so that you may not be cheated. I cannot be too particular." When it came to silver, gold, and jewelry, that last bit could not be more accurate. So from her will, we know that Couturier had made provisions to deposit a late aunt's silver plate and jewels, some 25,000 livres worth, in the Bank of Philadelphia. When the time came for her to flee, she did not travel light, and her will ends with this really incredible itemized memorandum of jewels that had been stolen in May of 1813. The most expensive was this Holy Ghost in diamonds, very large and big, which she said had cost 22,000 livres in London. Now, these sorts of elaborate pendants in the shape of a dove with outstretched wings were typically made of silver. They often featured flourishes like bows and flowers, and in the case of this particular example, comprised 6 pieces that could be taken to pieces at pleasure by unlocking them. The pendant itself could be worn with a ribbon, or as you see in this French example, with pearls. Really, more is more here. Couturier also mentioned a number of gold buttons and hairpins, as well as 15 pocket watches, some with chains, snuff boxes, a needle case, even a parasol top and earwax pick, or scoop, all of gold. Items of personal adornment included buckles, bracelets, necklaces, multiple pairs of earrings, dozens of rings, many featuring mounted gemstones and pearls. Not including that Holy Spirit pendant, the total cost of these items was $4,398.50 American. At least one of the necklaces was found by the time Couturier died, and she held out hope that her jewels might yet be found. She singled out specific pieces with qualities that might help lead to an arrest. So for example, a gold collar or necklace with an engraved inscription in French, tout à vous, or all yours, wholly yours. A round gold watch chain was said to be, quote, "so very remarkable a jewel," with a chain and key upon which the attributes of music were engraved. There's even an illustration of the engraving lower left. As she told the story, Couturier had smuggled this jewelry, all of it, out of Haiti, sewn in a shirt. It's very dramatic. "It is in that state I saved them," she wrote, "from the misfortune of Saint-Domingue, and since the Continental War used the same precaution for fear of accident. Again, I beg your pardon for giving this long detail, but I must inform you of all I can. One trifle may discover the thieves. I am leaving this world. You will represent me, and I hope will make the discovery." In addition to newer items, some of these were family heirlooms, like a beautiful jewel given to Couturier by her aunt. Some were undoubtedly made by local craftspeople, others imported from France. Such was the case for 20 solid gold buttons, described as being as large as doubloons and of about the same weight, also bearing the stamp of Paris on top and below. At the upper left, a repeating watch in gold of Lépine is even more specific in reference to Jean-Antoine Lépine, Parisian watchmaker and clockmaker to the king in the 1760s and 70s. Slim and sleek, these timepieces represented state-of-the-art technology and fashionable novelty, and they were often enameled, set with stones or pearls, as seen in this example that was brought back for a young lady in Charleston, South Carolina by her aunt. Her uncle was the ambassador of the United States, so shopping spree. Taken as a whole, the account of Madame Couturier's jewels certainly lends credence to the colloquial French expression of rich as a Creole, with income derived from sugar, coffee, and other commodities, leaving planters with more than enough disposable income to dress the part, both before and, it would seem, during their exile. Completed in Cap Français by a Canadian artist in 1791, I'm showing you a really extraordinary portrait now at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts that depicts an as yet unidentified woman, plausible relation to the royal governor, who also had his portrait painted by the same artist in the same year. This lady wears an abundance of gold at her ears and on her fingers. She wears not one, but 2 gold watch chains dangling from her waist. And I've paired this portrait with a 1785 announcement placed by a Monsieur Collet one of dozens from the affiche that detail the commercial activities of colonial goldsmiths. Collet styled himself a goldsmith and jeweler, not in Cap Français, but Port-au-Prince, and we see him announcing his recent arrival, presumably from France, along with an overview of his merchandise, all kinds of jewelry, gold watches and chains, buckles, charms, as well as snuff boxes and silverware for the table. Collet also offered repair services, and he stated that he could mount diamonds according to the latest taste. And you see this often, as we saw in Luke's talk, with the most fashionable, the most genteel, the novelty factor. So they're certainly retailing fashionable things, and they want would-be customers to know that you're getting the newest thing, despite some time elapsed between metropole and colony. Now, I do want to pause and acknowledge that white colonists were not alone in this culture of Caribbean consumption. Completed in the mid-1770s, this image I'm sure is familiar to many of you now. It's been making the rounds as more and more people discover and rediscover Caribbean art of the 18th century. Depicts a free family of color from Martinique, brimming with details. I actually love the parasol hanging next to the hammock. The broom is really fun. But if we zoom in on, again, a free family of color enjoying what appears to be coffee, we can more clearly make out what appears to be a ceramic service, complete with cups and saucers, a matching sugar bowl, and silver. The woman with the hat appears to have rested hers on her overturned silver spoon on the saucer. The gesturing woman at right has set hers directly on the table. It's an extraordinary visual record of people who, despite a marginal legal status, possessed fortunes, or could possess fortunes, that might rival those of many white colonists. Also a reminder that use, let alone ownership of silver, was not an exclusively white prerogative. A French account of a Carib dinner in 1793 is also revelatory for what it reveals about silver. Having traveled from St. Lucia to St. Vincent, d'Auxion-la-Vis was greeted by black Caribs, a mixed race group also known as the Garifuna, whose ancestry is Arawak, Kalinago, or Island Carib, and African or Afro-Caribbean. The French traveler was treated to a midday meal by a black Carib trader named La Rose, who served him a repast of crab soup, stewed and fried fish, roasted fowl, and fruits, all washed down with rum punch, and served on a, quote, very white table linen and in dishes and plates of Wedgwood's ware with silver forks, spoons, etc. The author mentioned how his host did business in both St. Lucia and Martinique. Also, he lived in a European-style house. But this suggests that many of the serving wares and utensils had been procured in those colonies from either local merchants or perhaps local goldsmiths or silversmiths. It's an intriguing reference, and what I love most about it, again, it's a reminder of how much there is left for us to learn and discover, and certainly food for thought when making sense of images like those by Brunius that we often fall back on as illustrations, an image which in this case leans more heavily into a supposed primitivism than the refinement we have alluded to in the verbal record. So back in Saint-Domingue, I have just a couple of more portraits I'd like to look at with everybody. At left, now it's at right we see Madame Reynaud, who was born on the island in 1748, just a year after Madame Couturier with all her jewels. This lady had married a French officer in the port of Les Quais in 1766. She was widowed 11 years later in 1777. This is a family that owned several sugar plantations outside of town. And in 1786, mother and daughter at center, Aimée, traveled to Nantes, so just in time for the French Revolution. They were imprisoned and narrowly escaped the guillotine before heading to Philadelphia. A son went to Louisiana. The portraits are neither signed nor dated, but based on the hair and clothing, they could very well have been completed in the colony. At the very least, we're left with this compelling visual point of reference for Creole self-fashioning on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, including these long dangling earrings that we see in contemporary Louisiana portraits as well. I also had to include the veiled eye miniature at left with hair work. This spells A-B. It's said to be that of Aimée de Bruès, probably perhaps sent to her brother in Louisiana. And the portraits all descended with the same family in the New Orleans area. So clearly, a miniature in its gold case. Clearly, imprisonment and exile had done little to temper this Creole family's taste for luxury. So whether due to theft or bad luck, loss of valuables was something experienced by many Saint-Domingue refugees. For example, en route from Cap Français to Charleston in the summer of 1793, the Anglo-American brig Thomas was attacked by a Bahama privateer. As recorded in the Charleston City Gazette, 35 prime slaves and upwards of 60,000 crowns in cash and plate were taken. These effects belonged to, quote, the unfortunate passengers who were flying from the havoc of distress and massacre with a small vestige of former opulence and prosperity. The Thomas was departing Haiti in the wake of the June 1793 Cap Français fire, in which revolutionaries essentially sacked the city. Popular culture abroad seized upon the violence enacted by Haitian revolutionaries on the colony's white population more generally, and you see this in the frontispiece here at left, from an 1815 history of the Haitian Revolution, which refers to the massacre of ostensibly innocent whites. Of course, these kinds of sources adopt a white or European perspective, something that came at the expense of both enslaved people and their suffering and of the revolutionaries' reputation. The Charleston newspaper's report on cruel and piratical depredation aboard the Thomas in 1793 is equally harrowing, with vengeful slaves replaced by villainous pirates. A third of the paragraph from that first coverage at right is dedicated to the fate of a white infant, the child of a lady of respectability, who had died or rather pined away and expired for want of nourishment after its enslaved nursemaid was forcibly taken from the ship, and this was all in spite of the mother's supplication upon bended knee and gushing tears. 36 of those white Haitian passengers who survived the 1793 shipboard attack also submitted a meticulous report of their stolen property upon arrival in Charleston. The report was published in another South Carolina newspaper, the State Gazette. Again, the sheer volume and the value of this property are extraordinary for what they reveal about the value of silver in relation to enslaved people. So for example, the citizen Archevêque Thibault had traveled with 36 silver spoons and forks, 18 ragout or stuffing spoons, 3 soup spoons, a pair of candlesticks, 2 butter boats with their stands, 2 tureens, 2 coffee pots, 1 large and 1 small, a small teapot, 4 salt cellars, and other pieces which he could not recollect, but the whole marked ZT, an olive Paris plate. It's a lot of silver. But the individual in question may have been that seen at right, who represented Saint-Domingue at the Estates General in 1789 and in the National Constituent Assembly that same year. He died in Guadeloupe. I think it's him, but I'm trying to make sure it's not a relation. That's the trouble with these kinds of sources. So it's kind of maybe a wild goose chase, but one that I find quite fun. If anyone also knows who is marking their silver ZT in Paris in the late 18th century, I would love to know that too, just to get a sense of what these things might have looked like. So the specificity is interesting when we compare that entry to one describing a large coffee pot brought by another passenger, citizen Frenty, described as, quote, without mark. In addition to his coffee pot, Frenty's losses included 25 half-Joe gold coins and 10 sets of silver flatware, along with some soup and more ragout spoons. Now, most of the silver took the form of serving or tablewares, at least some of which we now know had come from Paris. Other pieces were undoubtedly made in the colony and may have resembled the spoon on screen made by a silversmith named Lalonde. Very French, somewhat old-fashioned. The fiddle-shaped form is quite simple without any thread or other decoration. And again, my thanks to Wynyard for alerting me to this rare object's existence. The spoon bears the mark Lalonde au quai, Lalonde at the quai, or les quais, on the underside of that flat-stemmed handle. It's probably due to the fact that the spoon was made so late and in the more remote town of les quais that it lacks that 1781 mark. Lalonde's identity likewise remains to be established, but the now faintly engraved W and possibly a C on the back of the handle point to a degree of personalization. And so here I have the back of the spoon that you can see, the reverse of that same spoon. I note that the Saint-Domingue refugees traveling aboard the Thomas in 1793 described many of their possessions as, quote, nearly new, suggesting that they were bringing not only their newest things, but maybe their best things. And the examples you see at left document, again, the usual cross-section of forks and spoons, along with more specialized forms, candlesticks, a sugar dish, an oil cruet, and a stand to hold 2 bottles and 2 bottle stands. You have to love the description of a coffee pot of 12 cups owned by citizen Ferron and the 4 coffee spoons owned by citizen Moreau. Seems that coffee was a creature comfort that few were willing to do without, even as they ran for their lives, silver coffee pots and coffee spoons in tow. Now, not every claimant put a price on their lost items, but again, when they did, the amounts are staggering. The widow Pacou had packed close to 1,000 livres worth of silver, in addition to 30 half-jo gold coins. The most valuable item was yet another coffee pot, weighing to the value of 500 livres, followed by 2 candlesticks, 4 spoons, 5 forks, and a large soup spoon. She had also lost a 25-year-old enslaved woman, Mimi, who before the revolution had served her as a cook. In comparison, the widow Car had been deprived of 118 gold half-jo coins, in addition to 6 silver coffee spoons, 11 place settings, 3 large ragout spoons, a handsome gold watch, a child's coral with gold whistles and bells, and a silver-hilted sword. Now, I'm not sharing these stories to elicit sympathy for the Saint-Domingue plantocracy or to bemoan the loss of their possessions. If we look at the second widow's losses, we see that her legal property also included an actual child. 11 years old in 1793, Catherine was a Creole born in Saint-Domingue. She was without any stamp, meaning that she had not been branded, an especially brutal element of slavery in Saint-Domingue, not practiced necessarily as widely in other French colonies like Martinique or Guadeloupe. Sobering to consider this girl's fate amidst that of the silver coffee spoons and coffee pots, some marked, others not, as Catherine evoked in her lecture on Jamaica. On the one hand, the story of silver and society in Saint-Domingue is one of destruction, of actual objects, and of human lives. At the same time, displacement and diaspora indirectly facilitated the continuity of a Caribbean metalwork tradition on the North American mainland. So just to conclude, as their patrons fled or were murdered, some of Saint-Domingue's craftspeople headed for the hills themselves. The French-born Cap silversmith, Swiss-trained I should add, Jean-Simon Chaudron, went to Philadelphia in 1793, whereupon he retailed French silver plate. He was also very busy publishing a Francophone newspaper and investing in a failed land venture for the French exiles in what is now northwestern Alabama. He actually died in Mobile, Alabama himself. The surviving hollowware with Chaudron's mark appealed to an Anglo-American taste for the neoclassical. I think there's not so much specifically French or let alone Caribbean about this very ambitious tea and coffee service at upper left, created in Philadelphia in partnership with a Bavarian silversmith, Anthony Rash, who would himself move to New Orleans in 1820. In comparison, Pierre Lamotte of Saint-Marc stayed closer to home, moving to eastern Cuba in about 1803. However, Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and Spain saw the expulsion of all Haitian exiles from Spanish-controlled Cuba. By 1810, more than 10,000 of these expatriates, including the Lamotte family, had disembarked in New Orleans, a Creole city with deep French roots, referred to by some as the northernmost Caribbean city. Early examples of Louisiana silver by Pierre Lamotte, such as the 4-tined fork at left, resemble the simple Haitian spoon marked Lalonde. I also remark here that the former calls even earlier Quebec silver, and there's a connection to be made between Canada and the Caribbean and the Gulf South as well. Another topic for another talk. A Francophone who may have also spoken Spanish, Lamotte was easily assimilated into New Orleans Creole society, and he did not hesitate to seek new Anglo-American clients. The bilingual inscription on this engraved brass plate identifies him by trade in French and in English, and it's believed to have been used to advertise his shop at 52 Royal Street on the edge of what is now known as the French Quarter. The reverse features later engraving with the name of Lamotte's son, Jean-Baptiste, whose occupation is likewise given in English and in French. Also born in Haiti, the younger Lamotte was still working in New Orleans on the eve of the American Civil War. Lamotte family flatware, serving pieces including ladles, tumblers, and other forms, embody the legacy of craftspeople for whom memories of the Caribbean were hardly relegated to some distant past. Of course, Lamotte and his peers were themselves heirs to several generations of French Creole silversmiths whose careers had unfolded on the banks of the Mississippi River. So by way of an actual conclusion, one of the best documented of these is one Jean-Dominique or Jean-Baptiste Dominique Bunel of New Orleans, who apprenticed with a French immigrant silversmith in 1738. Bunel appears with regularity in the records of Louisiana's Superior Council, especially as his debts increased towards the end of his life. Receipts and bills survive for silver, ranging from sword hilts to silver pipes, many of which Bunel made alongside an enslaved African man named Jacob. Bunel freed Jacob in 1764, willing him his tools, and he's identified as a goldsmith himself. At left, we see the outstanding balance due to Bunel's estate for an order that included 9 silver spoons and forks, 6 coffee spoons, 2 ragout spoons, a soup spoon, a porringer or a bowl without a lid, and a seal. So this brief introduction to Bunel, something of a teaser, my apologies, but a promise, I think, of things to come, an exciting history that has yet to be fully written, and one that I am no less excited to pursue as we advance our study of Caribbean silver's French connections. So thank you very much.